Thank you, Ronnie. Firstly, I'd like to thank Kylie for asking me if I felt comfortable in speaking at this forum. I must say, quite nervous, but honoured to be here in front of you all. In the broader community, when the topic of diversity and difference is raised, it is commonly understood to be referring to the race and colour of an individual or demographic. As healthcare workers, by the mere fact of our working environment, we know that it means a lot more. We interact with members from varying race and cultures, patients young and old, able and disabled, patients with mental health concerns, and some will care for members of the LGBTQI community. In the context of diversity and difference, I'd like to take you on a journey through the life of someone born in a body that conflicted with the gender they would eventually become to identify and accept. I was born into a military family, and unfortunately I was quite young when my father was taken from us on his return from the Vietnam War. Being that young at the time, I would not have understood the enormity of that event. I remember as early as 4 years of age that I had this urge to try on my sister's clothes. Of course, I was too young to know why I did this, but I remember it provided me with a sense of comfort. I kept this activity as my little secret for over 4 decades. My mother remarried into a strict Catholic household, which now looking back was not too dissimilar to the Brady Bunch. There were 3 boys and 3 girls living at home. And yes, if I remember correctly, we did have a housekeeper. Within 3 years, 6 became 7, with a little sister arriving and bringing much joy to the family. Tragically though, that little angel was to leave our lives way too early at the young age of 17. Growing up, we were encouraged to partake in stereotypical gender roles around the home and in public. In saying that, I was not very good at sports and was inwardly jealous that I could not do ballet like my older sister, but knew not to outwardly express my wish. The streets and school playgrounds in the 70s did not feel like an inclusive environment if you showed any resemblance of being different. Unfortunately, this difference was seen as a sign of weakness, and I became an easy prey for one of my teachers in middle school. This abuse lasted the whole year, resulting in a severe element of mistrust of anyone outside the home. As a child, when you do not fit into any particular group, you find yourself isolated and questioning what is wrong with you. This feeling is no different to one you would have going through adolescence and adulthood in the same situation. You ask yourself, why do I not fit in? What have I done for them not to like me? What those same kids or adults fail to realise is that your difference could bring a new component to the group, which, given the opportunity, does not necessarily have to be different, or indeed negative. I'm very fortunate I did not grow up in today's era of social media. I'm not sure I would have survived that experience. As a result, I've never attended any school reunions as they hold very bad memories for me. I decided in 1984 I would join the military like my father before me. The military was known to me as a big happy family of brothers and sisters that looked out for each other. I still had this urge to wear female clothing, but knew as an adult in this environment, this activity was something not to be caught doing. Well, that didn't work as it was supposed to, as here I was, 18 months in a 4-year enlistment term, when someone found my private collection of clothes. This could not have been any worse for me. In the 80s and 90s, bastardisation and bullying in the Defence Force was seen as an accepted practice, and one that was never reported. Everything I had hoped to gain from the military went out the window. I was ostracised, had my belongings stolen, assaulted, left in the middle of a bush training area to make my own way back into the barracks. I could not go to my superiors as culture was ingrained into all members. At that time, I'd already heard of 2 other members in the previous 12 months that had taken their lives. You cannot prepare yourself for this, so I did all I thought I could do and I ran away. I felt I'd let my father down, but did not know how long I could have survived in this environment had I stayed around until my colleagues got tired with me and moved on to another target. At this stage in life, I still identified as male and presented in a way that both family and friends expected of me, even though I was still in conflict with my identity. I found myself drawn to women more and more, but not in a physical way, which added to the confusion. My first marriage was in December 1987 and was over by 1989. We found ourselves travelling a different path and felt we were both way too young. Thankfully, we are still good friends today. My next de facto relationship began in early 1990 and lasted for 5 years. During that relationship, we had a son who was born in 1991. Both he, his mother, and his siblings have been very supportive of who I am today. During my time with both these women, I still believed that I was male, but the struggle definitely affected our relationship to a point where we could not stay together as partners. During the periods above, my next venture into the environment that was male-dominated was as a prison officer at Pentridge Prison in Melbourne. During this period, I observed a culture that was biased against women in this job role. It was perceived that any female that took on a role as a prison officer would eventually be found in a relationship with a male prisoner or was professed as being overtly gay. This to me made it extremely difficult for any female to prove her worth as a competent officer who would not run away from any conflict, but would be by their side and there to support their fellow officers. However, what I personally found was that as a female presence on more than one occasion enabled a situation to be resolved without any violence from either side. Instead of being judged by their gender, everyone should have been respected for what they could bring to the team, and whatever, if any, they lacked could be encouraged and assisted to improve as you would for any staff member, regardless of gender. This misconception, perceived bias, was also noticeable to anyone that did not have a military background or who were not English, Irish or Scottish heritage. Although it is a career that I would never wish to return to, it did give me further insight into the disparity and lack of diversity in this type of workforce. In 1999, I found myself attracted to a woman who I'd met online. We became quite close and married in 2001 and had a little boy in late 2002. There was clearly a pattern forming that perhaps I like to move things on rather quickly in these relationships in the hope that this new experience would bring that mystery answer to who I really was. As shown earlier, this was not successful. In 2000, whilst we were still in Melbourne, I thought perhaps now that I had experienced more in life and gained more life skills, that I would attempt to re-enter the military forces if they'd have me. To my surprise, I was successful in my enlistment and reconnected my military career. I felt I'd gone full circle and I was home again. Over the course of the next 5 years, unfortunately, my life went from one extreme high to one of walking a very fine line with suicidal tendencies. I found myself being drawn more and more back into my secret life. Yes. This, along with problems in the workplace, caused considerable unrest in our marriage. I had to come clean about my secret for the first time ever. Although hesitantly supportive, my wife at the time, I felt I probably took that support for granted. I needed to find out who I was, and this hurt our relationship incredibly. We moved to Sydney from Darwin with the Army, and I found my job role extremely tormenting. It showed me that nothing had changed in relation to bullying. By supporting the other female soldiers in the environment, my life was made unbearable even though I was supposed to be one of the boys. The military police at the time was not a good place for females to work. It was clear that they were not respected by their peers. It was in the beginning of 2005 that I arrived at my lowest point. In this era of Defence Force, there was finally equal rights for those who made public their sexual orientation. Unfortunately, though, anyone that identified as opposite to their physical gender would be classed as having a mental illness and seen as a person who was not fit to serve their country. As soon as you made it known to your superiors, you would be medically downgraded and discharged as mentally unfit, following the existing defence instructions. The very next day after my discharge in October 2005, I commenced a public servant role with the Defence Force. Apparently, I was not that mentally unfit to have a high security clearance as a civilian, just not as a soldier with access to weapons. It was also at this time that I was told to move out of the family home. I was thankful, though, that I was given access to my young son, although this did not last for very long. I lived in my car for a short time until I had enough money to get a unit. As I commenced my new employment, I thought it prudent to allow my new work colleagues to get to know me as a person, without any surprises just yet. For this, I allowed myself 12 months before I began my transition. Having witnessed firsthand how judgmental and damaging it can be in a military environment, if you were different, I felt this was the best course to take. As it turned out, my colleagues were 100% behind me. They saw the value of my working capability and the friendly relationships we had built and treated me with immense respect. My second day of birth was the 15th of February 2008. This was probably the scariest day of my life. Everything went well, and I was back at work in 2 months. Of course, they were all curious about what happened, but were too afraid to ask. And our good, respectful working relationship continued in a positive manner for a further 9 years before I took up nursing. In 2010, the Australian Defence Force repealed the defence instruction that effectively barred anyone that identified as transgender to remain serving their country, enabling them to transition in their role and for their service to continue. This, of course, proved too late for me, unfortunately. The Australian Defence Force has now become a world leader in acceptance and support of gender-diverse members of the military forces. In the middle of 2010, I was now able to re-enlist in the part-time army and was treated as any other soldier, regardless of my past or my gender. This showed me just how far defence had come in recent years. By the time someone reveals their confusion with their gender identity to their employer and colleagues, they've more than likely already told their family and friends. They'll most likely be dealing with the consequences and fallout of that news, which could result in the separation of the domestic and family relationships, child custody and access issues, which could result in the and exclusion from their previous social circles. I was fortunate that my family were very supportive. In saying this, my wife has withheld my son for the last 13 years. He turned 16 this year. Over the years since my transition, I've built a new professional and social network that accept me for who I am and do not identify me as a medical condition. It does help that they never knew me previously. With the conflict I had going inside my head, I found it easier to keep people at a safe distance to avoid those difficult questions of which I did not have an answer to. In doing this, I could come across as a negative and angry person. Of course, this was not who I was, but how I thought I needed to present, which did isolate me from a lot of social circles. Through the course of my life, I've witnessed the most heinous of negative attitudes and actions to those who are considered socially different. As a result, I've ensured that my behaviour has been non-judgmental and promoted the considerable positives in encouraging a diverse working environment. I have felt and witnessed how the sense of inclusiveness has had an effect on my job satisfaction. As a past human resource recruiter, I know that job satisfaction was the biggest marker that translated to a reduction of turnover of our staff, which also translated to considerable savings in recruitment actions. To support this, I conducted an anonymous survey on staff's job satisfaction and found the effectiveness and productivity of staff who were valued for their efforts instead of shunned for their differences created a supportive, happy working environment. On a personal level, although I was not in my position to receive pats on the back, I did feel a sense that recognition for my efforts and encouragement to utilise my individual perceptions and viewpoints had a positive effect to the organisation's outcomes, so a win-win for everybody. I met the man who would eventually become my husband in March 2010. We met online, which in itself was seen by many as taboo. On my profile, I'd put everything about me. There could not be any secrets or any lies. Unfortunately, as with any search for a soulmate, you have to sift through the chaff to get the good fodder. We married in November 2015 in Melbourne. Yes, I had been married twice before and had a long-term relationship in between, but this one very much ticked every box for me, and I know for the right reasons. As a result of having several operations over the years of my transition, I came to really appreciate the role of nurses and what they represented. I observed the intoxicating passion in how they provided their care to me and the other patients around me. There was no judgment or hesitation in their approach. They created this sensation that everything was going to be okay. They were amazing throughout my recoveries and were there when I was at my worst in pain and again when I was fully recovered, wishing me the best for my future. Their unwavering kindness and compassion made the experience so much easier to deal with. This stayed with me each and every time I left the hospital and ultimately fed my desire to become a nurse and provide the same passion to those that I cared for. In August of 2012, after lengthy discussion with my husband and with his support, I made the decision that I would leave my safe public service role and take extended leave and commence my diploma of nursing in February 2013. This was scary for me, making this change on the verge of turning 50. I didn't know if the younger generation that I would be studying with would be accepting of the old girl in the class with a slightly husky voice. The course was 18 months long, so I couldn't keep saying that I had a cold. As it turned out, the old wise girl was pretty cool and all went well. Through my student placements, I was able to observe the nursing practice from the other side. The vast majority of healthcare staff I interacted with as a student enhanced my experience and provided me with a lot of support and encouragement. The placements not only enabled me to see what type of nurse to transition some of the theoretical skills into practice, they also gave me an idea of what type of nurse I'd become. I've had a lot of time to observe people and have a keen sense when the cogs in their brains are spinning madly, trying to work out the best way to approach that white elephant in the room. Is she or is he? For me personally, I encourage people to ask questions. Otherwise, how will you know the answers? These questions can get in the way of a great working relationship, if not put to rest. If I'm uncomfortable with the questions, I probably will not answer, but I will tell you why. The most important thing to remember is to not hold back with asking a question because you feel it may offend me. I'm not saying this is the best way for you to deal with relationships with someone in your workplace, but it works for me. I feel it comes down to how you approach the individual. For most occasions, the issue lies solely with you. I would hope that my behaviour to colleagues, patients or family members is one that embraces what makes them different to me. This may or may not bring challenges to how I interact with the situation, but I can guarantee I learn from every experience. I see myself as an educator now as well as a nurse. I'm more than happy to pass on my experience to anyone if they feel they would like some guidance. I believe the events that have occurred to me along my journey have moulded me into the strong, compassionate, tolerant, honest and empathetic nurse and woman I am today. I approach my nursing care as a privilege to be part of my patients' journey to health, and I see my co-workers more as friends than colleagues. I don't care whether you're male, female, young or old, or present on the ward telling everyone you identify as a platypus. I'll work with and care for anyone that is willing to provide me the same courtesy. The end result is a positive outcome for the patient and a happy working environment. I love who I am today. It took a long time to get here. I'm so much happier with being the daughter, sister, auntie and wife. To my sons, I'll always be their father and parent, and I'll answer to whoever they wish to call me. 3 things I'd like you all to take away from this is continue accepting and respect those you work with, regardless of what you perceive about them as different. As an individual, accept and be proud of the very thing that people don't accept about you and see as different. And unless you are able to openly and accurately define that term normal, it is best to refrain from judgmental perceptions that will affect your patient care and your working relationships. At the end of the day, that difference makes us an individual and allows us to bring new dimensions to the table. Thank you for your time.